Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As you rightly said, when I was asked to speak at this conference several weeks ago, the organizers said, we'd like to hear your thoughts on corporate governance, but if you'd like to add a few words as a postscript to the referendum, please feel free to do so. So, I'm going to do what all politicians would do. I'm going to do precisely the opposite to what I was asked and turn it round for reasons that you will appreciate. I will say a word about corporate governance because, quite frankly, I think you're going to need some good corporate governance over the next few years. But really, I want to concentrate on the referendum. I will make references to some of the things that happened in 2008, not least because if you look at the result of the referendum last week, a lot of it is the direct cause of the crisis that happened in 2008. And you know, when I was listening to the panel there, all of whom are experts and who I've listened to on a number of occasions before, I just thought how rational you all are. The decision last Thursday, in my view, was not based on a rational assessment of a balance sheet or what rules and regulations or even David Cameron's agreement that he got in March. I bet you if we had a whip round, none of you could actually remember what was in it. That referendum was fought on emotion. And to a large extent, it was immigration, it was fear of people coming here, it was fear of people coming from Turkey. That is what clinched it. And for a lot of people, and you know, Vernon was quite right when he was telling you about the turnout amongst different age groups. But what is so striking is the gulf between the way people in London voted and people 20 miles away from here voted. People voted overwhelmingly in London to stay, as they did in Scotland. I live in Edinburgh, where 3/4 of us voted to stay. But with the exception of Manchester and Bristol, and Leeds to some extent, Newcastle just, England voted very heavily to leave. And when you visit parts of England, it's not too difficult to see why that is the case, because you do go through towns and cities with high streets that are boarded up, where shops have changed from being grocers and butchers and all the rest of it to being second-hand stores, where people's incomes have fallen. And for a lot of people in that position, and who've had, feel that the last 6 years have been the wrong end of austerity and the people who caused it sort of got away with it, it's not surprising that when they were asked a question, they chose to answer it in a way they thought was appropriate. And I want you to keep that in mind, because when we discuss what the UK should now do in terms of trade and what sort of relationships and so on, at some stage we will have to go back to the same electorate, either in a referendum or possibly you could do it through a general election, I don't know. But you're not going to win the argument a second time around on the finer points of a trade deal. People are still going to say, well, what is it that's going to be better for me? Why is it going to be better if I vote to stay in? And one other thing I would say, as some of you will know, I was deeply involved in the Scottish referendum campaign, and we did actually win our one. I speak with some experience here. You can't just win on the basis of cold facts. They always help. But at the end of the day, it's a mixture of emotion as well as the facts, heart and head. And, one of the things we have in Scotland is the majority of us do feel proud of being Scottish and British, whereas, of course, with the European Union, we don't have that same warmth there. So it's not going to be easy. And whilst, I hope rationality will apply, it is not, don't be under any illusion that if only this is sorted out very sensibly in the way that many of you might do in your businesses, then everything will fall into place. Now, I said at the weekend, and I still believe that today, that I am more worried about what is happening now than I was in 2008. Now, don't misunderstand me. 2008 was a pretty difficult time. I have only had one very scary telephone call in my life, and that was in the morning of the 8th of October 2008, 2 weeks after Lehman's had collapsed, when the entire banking system was grinding to a halt. And I'd gone to Luxembourg for one of these finance ministers' meetings that are held every month. These are the ones that future chancellors of the Exchequer will not have to be going to because we're not members anymore, despite the fact they do have some uses. But by the time I landed in Luxembourg, RBS shares had been suspended by the stock exchange not just once, but twice. And you'll understand if you look at yesterday why some memories came back to me. And when I was in this meeting, I was summoned out to speak to the then chairman of RBS, who said that the bank was absolutely hemorrhaging money. And remember, at this time, RBS's balance sheet was about the size of our total GDP. And I said, well, look, we've got a plan. We've been working on the plan. We're ready to go. We just need a little bit more time. I said, how long can you last? And I thought, he might say, well, only a few days now. And what he said is what shook me to the core. He said, well, 2 or 3 hours. And then we'll have to close the doors. The cash machines will go off. And you can imagine what would happen then. What happened with Northern Rock 12 months earlier would have looked like a Sunday afternoon picnic. Because if people couldn't get the money out of RBS, then they would soon turn to every other bank in the UK, and as the American markets open, they'd start looking at the American banks as well. We were within 2 or 3 hours of seeing a complete collapse of the banking system, not just in this country, but probably through much of the world. Now, I'm not just saying this with the benefit of hindsight. We could actually see what to do. The problem was that the banks were undercapitalized, and the answer was to capitalize them proper, to strengthen them. Yes, there was a matter of confidence, and that's why it was important that the Americans and the Eurozone came in with us. But we were able to erect a firewall and stop a collapse. And the reason that I say it's worse this time is because this time it's not just one problem you need to fix. It is several problems, and I suspect that while some of them may not be as bad as you think, the problem is as time goes on, and remember, we will never be dealing in a static environment. If things become more complicated, things that are not a problem today might be a problem further down the line. And when you have the overlay of the fact that you're not just dealing with a situation in this country, we don't know what to do. This is not like a divorce, amicable or otherwise, in that normally you have two people involved. Here you've got one involved and 27 on the other side who don't always speak with one voice and have all sorts of different interests. So I am concerned about this, and I think that the thing that perhaps links what I want to say in relation to the referendum, but also corporate governance, is if ever there was a case of avoiding what is called in common parlance groupthink or group speak, this is it. In the early years, in the lead up of 2008, there was a consensus that the financial services industry was fine. Getting into CDOs and things you didn't really understand was absolutely great because everybody else was doing it, so why shouldn't you be doing it as well? I'm sure you've all seen The Big Short, and you'll see the position people got into. What was striking is the groupthink in relation to this referendum. A few weeks ago, I spoke to a group of investors, all of whom I think would consider themselves to be sophisticated, very clever people, very astute, and the rest of it. And before I started to speak to them, the host said, let's do a poll. What do you think the likelihood of the UK referendum will be? And you know this, when he asked how many people thought we would leave, they came out with this consensus, 5%. And even after I'd finished speaking to them, I could only get that up to 20%. Because they were convinced this wasn't going to happen. And indeed, as one of the panelists said, what's striking on Friday morning is the surprise really in every quarter. I don't know why, because if you look at the polls, if you visited England outside London, it was blindingly obvious something was happening and that the signals were there if only you care to look at them. And even Johnson and the others who'd won were looking miserable, and I know very well why they were looking miserable, because they didn't intend that to be the result either. It was being done for other reasons, I think. But we have a situation today where the establishment, if you like, most people thought this would never really happen, and that's why there is no plan. The government didn't have a plan because it wasn't contemplating it. I happen to know that. And equally, the Leavers had no plan whatsoever, not least because they could never have agreed on a plan in the first place, even if they sat down and tried to come up with one. And that is one of the reasons that, that all of us ought to be concerned, because between now and September, October, we are going to have to come up with a plan, because the decisions that we take in these next few weeks could be critical as to what happens in the next few years. And I'd just like to say one other thing. I agree with Vernon Bogdanor on so many things. I don't think the ERM comparison quite works. We'd only just joined the ERM, So we hadn't been in it for very long. And it's rather like the 1930s. It was like being locked into the gold standard. It was wholly inappropriate. And when we came out of it, of course, the pound dropped, and we enjoyed the benefit of that. And of course, in the 1930s, we also had a government following a good old-fashioned, well, it wasn't old-fashioned then, but it was a Keynesian policy, which I thoroughly approve of getting the economy going. But this, what we voted for, is to end a 40-year relationship with the largest single market in the world, and to start the process of disentangling not just laws, but all sorts of other things that have linked us with Europe for an entire generation. And on top of all that, for good measure, not only do we not have a government, because now that David Cameron said he is going, I know in politics that once the Prime Minister says he's going, his authority goes with it, and it doesn't wait till September, it goes now. We have no opposition, although you'll see my party is going about that in a certain way to try and resolve that situation. I'd only say this, that government in this country only works when you've got a strong government and a strong opposition. Because if you haven't got an opposition, people in government will assume they can do all sorts of things, and it really doesn't matter that they're going to get elected. And that is not a great position to be in. So what will happen? Well, we'll have a new Prime Minister by the beginning of September. Possibly we might have a new leader of the opposition as well. We'll have to see. But I don't think realistically very much is going to happen between now and then, because quite simply we don't know who the new Prime Minister is, and it's only the new Prime Minister that can set the tone of the government and the negotiation. So there's something of a vacuum there. I just hope that those seeking the leadership of the Conservative Party don't feel that during the course of the campaign they've got to start saying things that will mean negotiating is going to be even more difficult because they've made commitments. Although they may be flexible on that. I mean, I had been led to believe during this referendum campaign that if we voted to leave, then we were going to cut immigration. I was somewhat surprised on Friday morning to be told that no, that wasn't going to happen. And my guess is the majority of the population who voted for it were very surprised as well. But we shall see what is said then. But after September, I think the government will have to implement the Article 50 process fairly quickly, quite simply because I think the rest of Europe will do that. And if nothing else, it concentrates the mind, because you've got 2 years then to start reaching some sort of agreement. The other thing we will have to do is we will have to start building bridges with countries in Europe who we need to help us in these negotiations. It was said in the panel, and they're absolutely right, Chancellor Merkel is a good ally here. She never wanted Britain to leave, and actually the Germans and ourselves in our government, as well as in the present government, always work very closely with each other. It's just common sense that we will have to rebuild those relationships, and it's probably better done in private than it is in public. And whilst I hear what some of the panelists said about governments will listen to business, and business will say we want agreements quickly, politics doesn't quite work like that. You've got to understand the European Union is a political project. That's what drives it more than anything else. We're the only country that didn't join to escape our past, our political past. France and Germany did because of the turmoil of the 20th century. Spain did to escape the traumas of the Franco regime. The Eastern European countries did following their escape from the communist regime. So whilst business advice will be taken, it does not necessarily take precedence over the politics of the day. And in some quarters in Europe, the politics, the bemusement, the irritation, the anger in some cases of us leaving are something that's going to have to be dealt with. Because remember, in big things, any one of the 27 can veto anything. It's not a majority, it is an absolute veto. So in the next few weeks, and particularly after there is a new government in place, we'll need to decide what our trade relationship is going to be, and I don't want to go into detail what the options are. All I would say in relation to Norway and Switzerland, they do come with free movement of people. Now, I've got less problem with that than many, but as that was actually fundamental to the referendum campaign, it's going to be difficult for us to accept something unless, of course, the European Union itself starts to rethink that in the light of the migrant crisis. And as for a Canadian-type relationship, well, that would be interesting. I would just say that the Canadian agreement with the European Union is now in its 9th year of negotiation, and it's by no means certain it's going to get ratified. And this is a general point. Yes, now that we're leaving, we can strike agreements with countries all over the world, but it takes time to do it. There's about 70 treaties we're going to have to look at. and never mind, we will have to build up capacity. But all these things come with many strings attached. They're not all straightforward. And all that tells me that what we're in for here is a period of considerable uncertainty. I think it's optimistic it's going to get done in 2 years. Some of the big things may be decided then, but it will take possibly longer than that, and some of those aspects could take several years before they are resolved. And of course, the other uncertainty here isn't just on this side of the Channel. What's the attitude going to be of countries in the European Union? And they've got problems too. France has got a higher level of Euroscepticism than we have. Whilst a couple of years ago, if someone had said to you the French National Front might get elected next year, you can't say that won't happen. Any more than, when I was in America at the beginning of this year, I was told that Donald Trump would never get the Republican nomination. Well, now people are saying, could he win the presidency? There is a tide sweeping across much of the world that Trump has identified in the States. I've mentioned it, it's happening here, of people who feel alienated and disaffected with the establishment because they don't think it's serving them. And I'm afraid that is something that all governments are going to have to start dealing with. And of course, the other thing that, which may help us actually is Europe's in clear difficulties now because of the migrant crisis. It cannot cope with it. Perhaps it will mean they will look at free movement of people again, and that perhaps might allow a British government to say, well, look, there's been a change, so things have changed. But it's just too early to say whether or not that's the case. You talked briefly, or the panelists talked briefly about disentangling European laws. All I would say is that, I think my recollection is Parliament can deal, roughly speaking, with about 20 to 25 major acts of Parliament a year. When you look at our legal system since 1972, then much of our legislation either adopts or mirrors or follows legislation in Europe. Our competition law, intellectual property, right down to the conditions of medical equipment and so on, and then the environment. All of these issues are highly contested. The idea we're just going to simply either take it or leave it is just really for the birds. People will want to argue over each one of these pieces of legislation because they'll want to change it, either to make it less of a burden or perhaps more strict. So it will take time, and of course it does mean that you're being left with a massive uncertainty whilst we simply don't know what the law is. And there's one other aspect which is political rather than business, but it will be of concern to all of us, and me in particular on one of them. European law underpins the settlement that led to the peace process in Ireland. The Irish legislation has the Irish government as part of it. And that means that if we're going to leave, we're going to have to have a very close look at what that actually means. And I think for obvious reasons, nobody wants to give people a reason to start looking at that whole process again. The second piece of legislation where European law is enshrined happens to be the Scotland Act of 1998. Now, I just want to say a word about Scotland. The result 2 years ago was decisive, and we were told it was once in a generation, but of course most of us have never believed that the nationalists would ever let this go, and they've now been presented with a very opportunity they weren't expecting either. They didn't think this would happen, but it's there now. What I would say is, when you listen to reports of what the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, is saying, read everything she says. Because what she says is she's bringing forward legislation for another referendum. She's set up an expert group to advise her and all the rest of it. But then she goes on to say, but whether or not we have a referendum depends on whether or not it's in Scotland's interest. Now, what she means by Scotland's interest is whether or not she would win that referendum. And, she's an intelligent woman, and she will have watched what happened to David Cameron, who walked into a referendum campaign. He thought he was going to win, and he didn't. And you can lose one referendum on independence and come back, losing two. Rather like the Quebec movement have found, really means that's it. So don't assume there's definitely going to be another referendum, but equally don't underestimate the feeling there now is where, if the nationalist pitch is we are different from the rest of the UK, It's very difficult to argue that now. Interesting, they've dropped London from the rhetoric for obvious reasons. But I wouldn't assume there's going to be one, because the issues of what currency do we use, and I can tell you, even in Edinburgh, where we voted overwhelmingly to stay, the euro is as popular as it is in Essex. You know, it would be very difficult to sell. And of course, there is a small matter of the fact that we spend £15 billion more than we get in, which, you know, makes the Maastricht criteria look, you know, somewhat out of reach. Just one other point I'd like to say, that I think we need to reflect on what's happened here on Thursday, what's around in Europe generally, what's around in America, does, I think, mean that the assumption that we have made towards seeing increasing globalization, more and more sort of multinational global trade deals, I think that is going to be thrown into some doubt. And there's no doubt that protectionism is gaining a traction that you might not have thought, even you know, in the financial crisis 2 or 3 years ago. You know, it's something that I think will have an effect. A brief word on the economic uncertainty. I don't think there will be an emergency budget before there is a new Chancellor, and I think there will be a new Chancellor. But I think in the autumn statement, that is, you know, in 3 or 4 months' time, you'll have an opportunity to then see what the world looks like and, you know, what the UK looks like. But to me, it's going to be inconceivable that the British economy isn't going to slow again, simply because people have stopped taking decisions, because they don't know. And this is what happened to us in 2008. And my guess is that what the government would have to do is a bit of stimulus at the start, but with the promise that they're going to get it back a bit later on. I suspect that's the case, because that's precisely what I did in 2009. And interestingly, the present government has followed it, despite the fact they say they don't. They've ended up with a deficit exactly where I intended to end up in the deficit, simply because of the force of economic circumstances. So, you know, I am, you know, fairly downbeat about all this. If it means cancelling HS2, by the way, I'm with Vernon on that one, though I think I'm a minority in the House of Commons when I was there on that. I just don't think it adds up, and maybe we should start looking again at things like Hinkley Point and all that at the same time. But I think the economic outlook is going to be very, very uncertain here and elsewhere. A very brief word about corporate governance, and you know, I would have spoken a lot longer about that, and you'll either be disappointed to hear I'm not going to, or very pleased that I'm not going to. I just make one point, and you know, the point I was really touching on earlier, that if you look at what went wrong in 2008, at the end of the day, it was because people did not understand the risks that they'd taken on. And you know, I remember the night before RBS collapsed, actually, I had a meeting in the Treasury with the senior CEOs of and chairman of all our big banks. And at the end of it, a chairman and CEO asked to speak to me privately. And they said, look, I want to cheer you up. And I said, how's that? And they said, well, we had a board meeting earlier today, and we've decided that from now on, we will only take on risks that we understand. In case you're wondering, you still have a shareholding in that bank if you're a British citizen. But I think it makes a point that where things go wrong is where boards don't understand, or regulators don't understand what is going on, and where individuals are sometimes afraid to speak out. It can happen in government too. You know, governments reach decisions and people didn't say what they should have said at the time. And I think the key lesson that I draw from what happened in 2008 is that, you know, if it looks too good to be true, there's probably a good reason for that. And people should not be afraid to question, whether it's in government or in the boardroom. So with that, I'd be more than happy to answer more questions on regulation and on boardroom cultures or being a former politician, anything I didn't say about anything. Thank you very much indeed. I think I take the questions, correct? Yeah. Good. Who would like to go first? Yeah, I think there's a microphone. Is there? Microphone? Yeah, it's coming up behind you. Can I get a glass of water? Still, please.
If I could ask for a personal view, if you were in the government going forwards at this point in time, and you wanted to find a way of reconnecting with the voters outside London, Bristol, Leeds, etc., what are the sorts of, you know, what are the 2 or 3 things you'd think about doing such that the political establishment is more connected to those voting populations.
Thanks very much. Look, I think, when, a few years ago, when the Conservatives dominated the coalition, when Cameron and Osborne repeatedly gave the impression that they were, living in another world. Remember, they were called by one Tory backbencher two posh boys, with the pasty tax, the caravan tax, the tax credit stuff last autumn. They just give the impression that they were totally out of touch. So I think if I was in government now, one of the things that you have to do is to try and reconnect with people to show that the government is thinking about them, it's on people's side in relation to what they do, particularly in regard to their income, but also in terms of what they get in the health service and so on. I think the other thing is in relation to jobs, and this is a slightly longer term thing, really since the 1930s, but the situation has been accelerated in the last 20 or 30 years. Economic activity has been concentrated here in the southeast and in London. And I think that the Conservatives' Northern Powerhouse thing is fine, and I take the blame too because our government didn't do enough here. We should have been looking at the city regions, 20 or 30 years ago. But things like the Northern Powerhouse mean absolutely nothing to people at the moment because there's nothing to see for it. If people start seeing investment and seeing things taking place in their areas, then they might feel that things are working for them. It's interesting, if you look at north of England, Manchester had a very big Remain vote. But if you go to Manchester, it's not too difficult to see why, because it is vibrant. You've got a massive university presence there. There's been a lot of investment in Manchester City Council. You've got the trams and everything else. Go outside that area, and people say, well, we're not getting anything. It's all been sucked away from us. So I think what governments need to do is to show that they are as bothered about someone living in the English Midlands as they are about someone living here. Last Tuesday, when I was in the northeast of England, it turned out to be a futile campaign visit. I was struck by two things which perhaps illustrate what I'm trying to say. One is I spoke to this woman many of whose relations works in the Nissan plant in Sunderland. And she said one of the advantages of leaving the European Union is we would no longer have to pay duties on the cars we exported to the European Union. And I said, no, that's not right. It's the other way around. And she said, you're telling lies to me. In other words, all the argument about trade, and all the rest of it, the facts, if you like, had passed her by. And then her friend who was there said, and what's more, there's 70 million Turks waiting to come here in 2020. But when you look around where I was, and you've got, as I say, you've got boarded up shops where you've got no evidence really of, the economic gains that other parts of the country have made. And when I went home to Edinburgh that evening, which is like another planet compared to this, you can see why people get into that position. So there's no quick fix for this. But if we don't fix it, and I apologize to anyone here from UKIP, but UKIP will start making gains. And their pitch to people is pretty basic, it's pretty brutal, and in my view, it's very poisonous. But it'll take hold if we don't deal with it. Yes, the gentleman in there.
Good evening, Mr. Darling. Just taking this point forward, don't you think that successive governments have sort of let manufacturing down in the UK? And then the sector, there's a big imbalance, which has gone to service sector, but bricks and mortars is what's so key, So today steel, at one time UK used to supply steel to half the world, and today our steel industry is in doldrums. So isn't manufacturing should be the drive in the next 10 years? Hopefully now that, we are away from the European Union.
Well, look, firstly, I think you can make a very good argument that in many ways the past was sold maybe 30, 40 years ago, that we managed to lose things like shipbuilding and a lot of our heavy industries, where in Germany they managed to keep them. Now, that's partly government helping, but it's also a willingness on the part of investors to put money into it. For a long time after the war, we did not invest in our industries in a way that, frankly, the Germans and the Japanese had to. That's why now, I think I'm right in saying there's only 2 merchant shipbuilders left in the UK, whereas we used to make a quarter of the world's tonnage, 100 years ago. I don't think you're going to get that back in the scale, but what you can do, I think there's two things government could do. One is that it can give help where it's appropriate, and I don't mean subsidies, but for example, in research and development, where we have actually done a lot. Our government and the government that followed have done that, and I hope that's continued. And the other thing is to avoid doing things that you shouldn't do, and that's why when I hear talk about unilaterally dropping all our tariffs, that's as one of the one leave economists said, it will eliminate much of our manufacturing industry. I don't think that's a price that we should be prepared to pay. And if you look, you may not see the smokestack industries now, but we as a country, we have a lot of engineering expertise. We make a lot of car engines across the whole of Europe. And when I talk about this as things we shouldn't do, I can't see for the life of me how having a tariff imposed on an engine made in Bridgend in South Wales to go and to be fitted in a German car makes any sense whatsoever. Our car industry, we're making more cars and light vehicles now than we did in the 1970s, which was said to be the heyday of the motor manufacturing. And aviation, Airbus. And an Airbus is a collaboration between the 3 European states. What's going to happen to that? Airbus is, it's cutting-edge technology. It's very high-quality jobs, and yet people in North Wales voted quite heavily to leave. The disconnect I was talking about between what's happening and what's next to them. So I think. There's many things we could have done in the past. I'll get my retaliation first. I'm sure there's many things we should have done as a government. But we have some good things. I just, all the time in this campaign, I was thinking, why on earth risk any of it, frankly, when you don't need to? And now we've got a whole bunch of other risks that we don't want. Next time Airbus makes an investment, where do you think the aeroplane is going to be built? There's not much point in speculating, is there? Right, there's a gentleman right at the back, almost right at the back.
Thank you. David Cameron, amongst others, has been very clear that we won't have another referendum on this. Just wondering, do you think if there is a general election in the next 6 months or so, that could actually be another referendum on this, in the sense that potentially even a new political party emerging that's pro-Europe?
Well, look, let me deal with the general election first. To get a general election in this country now, it's not just a matter of the Prime Minister going to the Queen asking for a dissolution, which with a new Prime Minister she would automatically give. Now there's a law that says the Parliament's got to last for 5 years unless there is a vote of no confidence in the government. So the new Prime Minister would have to engineer a vote of no confidence in his government, which the public may think that's very odd. If you're not confident about it, why should we be? And you also have to persuade a sizable chunk of the opposition to vote for it. Now, if the opposition thinks it might win, it'll go along with it. If it thinks it might lose, you can see why it might be reluctant to fall in with this. So it's not as easy as it used to be the case to have a general election. But suppose you did have one. I think a general election might allow you to say, if you vote for us and we form a government, we propose to enter into an agreement with the European Union along such and such lines. And if you win that general election, the government could say, look, we've had a general election, we've got a mandate, we're here for the next 5 years, we'll get on with it, and who knows. I think it would be difficult to do that quickly, because what you can't do is go to the voters and say, we didn't like what you did last Thursday, and we'd now like you to have another go at it, and this time you've got to vote the right way. I mean, that's what some of the nationalists have been arguing in Scotland over the last couple of years, and I, for one, have said that's nonsense. I think you might have to have a second referendum if you came up with an agreement that didn't get, where you were keeping free movement of people, for example, except with 1 or 2 qualifications. But whether or not you'd get it, I don't know. And one of the things, that has crossed my mind is that if you do get a right-of-centre Brexit leader of the Conservative Party, it might be easier for him or her to sell something that others might regard as a sellout. Rather the way that Nixon could get the US to go and speak to China. A Democrat president might have found that more difficult. So I don't know. And indeed, where I think I'm at one with every single panelist, part of the problem is we do not know. And nor do we know what events might come along that completely change the way in which we look at these things. because governments do get distracted for good and bad reasons about events, and that can make decisions you take one week look very different the next. Yes.
I have a question.
You think you need a microphone too for the back? Oh, you got one.
Yeah, I just wondered, one of the kind of messages behind the Leave campaign was this idea that we'll be able to renegotiate favourable, or at least still decent trade arrangements with our EU or previous EU partners. What chance is there that EU will punish the UK to deter or prevent further exits in light of our own?
Well, look, when you're taking part in a political negotiation, they're unpredictable. And not least because for Europe to agree a trade agreement, you need to have all member states agreeing to it. And remember, they won't just be addressing the trade agreement with the UK. You may well find that governments like Austria, for example, which have just got a fairly right-wing government, or Hungary, where they've got a very right-wing government, can say, we will not sign up to this unless you do something for us. And that something for us is we want to stop free movement of people, which Nordic Europe might find more difficult to adopt. And you could get other countries that say, we're not interested in anything that bothers this trade agreement, but we want more agricultural assistance, or we want more structural funding, you name it. And that's why it takes such a hell of a long time to agree anything in Europe. I mean, I'm well disposed towards Europe, but I mean, as it's one of its supporters, I would never accuse it of acting at speed. It just doesn't do it. And and coming to your question, yeah, of course there will be politicians in Europe. Spain is an obvious, case in point, where, because of their own internal problems, in Barcelona, the Catalan question, where they might be reluctant to start doing things because if people get the idea you can break away and there's no pain. That's why they were so outspoken about the Scottish application to come into the European Union, because they said, no, there's no way you're going to do it, because we would then have the problem internally. That's why it makes the thing so difficult. And then on the other side, of course, you then got to persuade the Americans they want to spend time negotiating with us as opposed to, China. The Pacific Trade Agreement is far from, being a done deal. And of course, they, who knows what the two candidates are going to say during the presidential election campaign, because Trump is trying to force Clinton into a more protectionist position. So I'm not arguing none of these things can be done. But, when I said earlier that the panel was very rational, just having been, I've spent 13 years going to these ministerial meetings, and whilst there's a lot of rational people about, there are some times, especially late at night, when people can be very irrational. And the trouble is, once they've been irrational, it usually takes a long time to talk them down and to come to a thing where everybody can save face and move on.
I'll just jump in with one further point then. You obviously dismissed all the idea of a second Scottish referendum. Is there any likelihood or possibility of a federated EU membership for places like Scotland and Northern Ireland that want to remain, because it was a UK vote, but they might argue they want to stay in the UK but keep the EU, which surely would be better for the UK?
Well, look, I understand that argument, but as you know, the European Union is constructed on the basis that it's a union of nations, of nation states. Once you say a part of that, even if it's an identifiable part, like Scotland is a clearly identifiable country, you would then immediately, the Spanish question would arise: can Catalonia join? And which the Spanish government, as far as I can see, would say absolutely not. I mean, they won't even allow them a proper referendum, never mind anything else. The other thing is, there's an article of faith at the moment that if you join the European Union, you have to sign up for the euro. Now, how would it work if Scotland was still in the United Kingdom, with pounds circulating, to also have euros circulating? And then we get into free movement and the rest of it. And it's not, I've mentioned Spain because I just happen to know about that, but right across Europe, you don't have to go too far to find countries where similar issues would arise. But I think, despite everything I've said, it's probably easier to try and negotiate to salvage something from what we've got rather than to go down that particular route. Although I think I'm right in saying that is what Nicola Sturgeon is announcing this afternoon. But I hope that when she goes to speak to the 27 others, she also asks what the price might be. Because to allow us in and say, but you don't have to do anything about your deficit, you don't have to join the euro, you don't have to accept free movement of people, but otherwise you're absolutely fine. I would have thought that we're not quite at that stage yet. Yes. So, well, You go first, and then if you bring the microphone down to the front.
Okay, so just a quick question. Can you explain to us what you think will happen to Heathrow expansion and High Speed 2?
Well, you know, I'm in favour of the expansion at Heathrow, not least because I published a white paper suggesting that in 2003. And you know what? Which illustrates why nothing happens in this country, I may say. As an aside, I think many of the people in this room will have been on the M6 expressway around Birmingham, which I opened in 2005, I think it was. And I was interviewed by a BBC reporter who said, this must be a very proud day for the Labour government. And I said, yes, indeed, Harold Wilson would have been absolutely thrilled if he'd been here, because that's when it first appeared on the government radar. When I published the white paper, the permanent secretary of the Department of Transport said to me, you could know, of course, it'll never be built. And I said, why is that? And he said, you're the politician, but you've no doubt noticed there's more marginal constituencies around Heathrow than just about any other major project in the country. And, you know, Cameron, I don't think will get it through now, because the Tories are, you know, they'll say, let's leave that to the new government. If Johnson wins, it won't go through because he's so implacably against it. And in fact, I think all the contenders appear to represent constituencies either around Heathrow or on its flight path. So that maybe helps you in your question. I think it's a pity, but, you know, on top of everything else, if we don't deal with issues like this, and, you know, the evidence appears to be still pointing to Heathrow, it's not surprising if people are say, these guys can't make up their mind. We've got a big investment to make, let's make it somewhere else. Why on earth take that risk? The gentleman in the front, yes.
Can the Labour Party survive if Corbyn refuses to go? Just looking at the votes of no confidence, 172 for and 40 against.
Well, my view is that if Jeremy Corbyn remains a leader of the Labour Party, it will, far from being elected at the next election, it will face annihilation in large parts of the country. And again, I say that from experience. I've been out in very different parts of the country, and you mention his name, and the reaction from Labour voters, not Tories, Labour voters, is such they're just not going to vote for us. And I think one of the reasons that there was a big Leave vote last week is because a lot of people who would have supported us in the past don't see anyone around representing them. And they were given the opportunity to kick the establishment in the face, and they took it. You know, you can't win elections from the extreme on either side in British politics. You need to get the centre of ground, not least because that's, you know, where most people are. And, you know, I've never had a conversation with him, so I don't actually, you know, really know what he thinks, despite the fact we were in Parliament 28 years together. But I just do not think he can lead this. What I think will now happen is you have to get 50 people to nominate somebody, then there has to be a contest, which I think there will be. The question is whether on the same electorate that elected him last year there's been a shift. Now, I was talking to one of my colleagues on the way out who a lot of people joined his constituency on this cheap membership thing, which is a ridiculous proposition. You know, if you join a political party, surely to goodness you pay more than £3. And you know, that's, you know, nothing. But he was saying a lot of people who are just saying, actually, if we ever want to see a Labour government again, we need to change the leadership. So I put my cards on the table. It won't surprise you I didn't actually vote for him. You know, he's had a year, and he doesn't look remotely interested in the subject, never mind getting to be convincing. And, you know, I've met or known every leader since James Callaghan, and the one thing they all have in common is they desperately wanted to win because they wanted to change things, and they put their heart and soul into it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And nowadays that's what you need to do. So the answer to your question is, yes, I very much hope so. And the vote that you're reading out doesn't surprise me in the least. Yes, there's a microphone there, and then there was someone just behind you, yes. And then at the back.
Sorry, hi, I'm interested to find out your views on the role of the media during the campaign, and whether you feel that the case for the Remain campaign was adequately presented, and if there was bias in the different papers.
Well, look, all our papers are biased one way or another, and if you're a politician, or even a former politician, there is no point in moaning about it. You know, the Daily Mail was never going to come out for staying in Europe. equally the Guardian was never going to come out for a leave vote. What I think is a big problem is this, and that's in relation to the broadcast media. And it's a big problem for this reason that most people get their news from the broadcast media rather than from the printed media, even ones a sort of decent circulation. And I know that when we were running the Scottish referendum campaign, at the early stages, we did a lot of polling, and amongst other things, we wanted to find out who people trusted. Now, it won't surprise you to know that one of the groups, the least trusted groups in the country, are politicians. The only thing I would say, there's only one group that leaves us standing, and that's bankers, when it comes to trust. The organisation that is trusted more than anyone else in the country by a mile is the BBC. Now, the problem the BBC has got is it is obliged during the final period of election to give equality of coverage, which means that if you have someone saying that there are, Turkey is about to join the EU and 70 million Turkish people could come here tomorrow, they have to treat that in the same way as someone making a point about the economy. And every morning there was 2 assertions made, and what they weren't able to do, and I don't know whether this is the law or just the BBC's caution, is ever question these things. If, for example, the BBC had said to Messrs Johnson, Gove and Farage, okay, you win on the Friday morning, what's your plan? Now, and then if it had gone on to say, it's interesting that the plans are not the same, but they didn't feel they could do that because they had to treat all these things equally. I think you can't have a national broadcaster being biased. I mean, it couldn't come out one side or another. But I think it's got to have the scope to hold people to account. On the BBC, you've got a lot of good people who can actually do that. And it happens in elections. And some of the assertions made, on both sides, frankly, could have been torn apart if there were political parties in the election campaign. I don't know why it didn't happen in the referendum, but it didn't. The other thing is that, it's an old bugbear of mine ever since the 2007 on Northern Rock, 24-hour news is a real nuisance in the sense that when nothing much is doing, they show the same pictures over and over again, which gives you the impression that things are getting worse and worse and worse. And I'll give you an example. When Northern Rock, there was a run on Northern Rock, it was filmed in the morning with people queuing up, but they hadn't got any more pictures for the day, so they kept showing it. And then more and more people turned up because they'd just seen on telly these queues are still there. And it was actually the same people. And one of the things that we learned in Northern Rock was to avoid this problem is when the run started in September 2007, all the tellers argued with every single person wanting their money out. So that took a long time to do anything, and the queues built up. After that, Northern Rock were told that under no circumstances did you have any discussion whatsoever with somebody coming to the door wanting their money. You gave them the money and got them out of the building as quickly as possible, or if you had to have a queue, put them in the back office, and that way there was no news on the telly to show there was queues, despite the fact money was still pouring out of it. But it wasn't reported in that way. That's just an aside. But I think there's a real problem that in the referendum campaign that neither side were really questioned. The balance was achieved by you make an outrageous statement, you make an outrageous statement, there's 2 facts. And that's not good enough. Yes, and then there's a man right at the back. If you could wave at someone with a microphone, then you'll get in. Do you want to go first?
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask you, do you think that we will be seeing negative interest rates in UK and quantitative easing sooner rather than later? And would there be one piece of advice you would give to Mr. Osborne between now and 2nd of September?
Well, Rick, I'll come back to that one in a moment. On quantitative easing and negative interest rates, I'd just say a couple of things. Quantitative easing, in my view, only works as a part of shock therapy. We did it after the banking crisis, and we did it for a comparative short period of time, but it was coupled with the recapitalisation of the banks, and above all, with accompanying fiscal policy, because we put money into the economy. Quantitative easing is not a long-term therapy. I know the ECB, I think, is doing a very good job in Europe. But it's, as Japan shows, it isn't a long-term, solution. And I have great doubts about the whole idea of negative interest rates. If the problem is that people have lost confidence, charging them money to put their money in the bank isn't going to help. And they'll put it under the mattress instead or something. As Japan has shown, they've tried just about every remedy anyone's ever thought of, but they've got, the negative interest rates. It's still not working because people don't think the economy is going to grow, and that that you still got this threat of, of disinflation. And if people think prices are going to fall, why would they go and spend their money? Which brings me to the second point, that I think, although this is something that principally Germany has set itself against, both Europe, possibly now in the United Kingdom, though I don't think it would have been necessary but for Brexit, and even in the United States, perhaps we are going to have to go back to the idea that fiscal policy is not fiscal stimulus is not a bad thing, because monetary policy can't do all this by itself. Monetary policy is if you want people to spend money, actually, the best way to do it is to give it to them, and to give it to the people who will spend it, who tend not to be having the ones with lots of savings in a bank. So I think that policy is going to get revisited. The American employment figures are beginning to slow down again, so they may have to consider that. But if you look at the two economies that grew, unlike the European economy, after the crash in 2008, it's this country here, and it's the United States. Why was that? Because the governments at the time, and actually subsequently in this country, despite what George Osborne said, he put a lot of money into the economy in 2012. Both the American government, the British government, followed a Keynesian response. We put money into the economy, but then took it out over a longer term. Now, I think that might have to return. As for the advice of George Osborne, all I would say about this is I don't think he's much younger than me, and he will no doubt want to carry on as a member of the government. But certainly my experience when I was Chancellor of the Exchequer was a torrid experience. What I found is that people are really nice about you once they're absolutely certain you're not coming back. I'm there, but he's not yet. Now, I think there is somebody. Yes.
So to what extent do you think the Brexit vote is actually a broader signal to politicians, experts, the media, the establishment in general, in terms of the complete lack of ability to listen to the people and capture their hearts and minds? And in light of the behaviour of many individuals after the vote, what does that leave the public thinking now?
So I'll answer. What do you mean the behaviour? Can you be a bit more specific?
Well, depending which side you're on, people are changing their mind, going back on what they've said. General shock. I have to say, I live in London, but I'm a northerner, and I'm not surprised at all, because when you go out into the country, people have a very different way of life and a different set of values. And I just wonder, if you look at the behaviour now being played out in Westminster and all the rest of it, how can that help people think that actually these people are inspirational enough to lead our country?
Well, look, let me, I covered some of this ground earlier on, but just make a couple of points. The first one is that we have to be very clear that the referendum result showed a clear majority of this country want to leave the European Union. That doesn't mean things may change, can't change in the future, or you come back and say, well, look, here's a different relationship. But what you can't do is ignore it. And that's why I think Article 50, that's the first step you take, has got to be engaged very quickly. Because if you don't do that, people will be very disillusioned. The second thing I would say is that this referendum campaign, whether you like it or not, and I didn't, was largely fought on immigration, on the scare of immigration. If you then get, as happened the morning afterwards, one of the prominent Leave campaigners saying, we never said we'd cut immigration, that will come as news to 17 million people who voted to leave, because they were given the impression that would happen. And equally, when they've been saying that £350 million that was going to be spent on the National Health Service, well, it was just indicative. That is when you get real disillusionment. That's where Farage will be in there like a shot, saying you can't trust these these establishment parties. We are different now. Let's leave aside whether he's different or not, because you can have a long discussion about that, and you might come to the view that he's not. But I think you cannot. Look at what happened to the Liberal Democrats when they made that stupid promise on tuition fees. If they hadn't made it and they'd put the fees up, people may not have liked it, but it wouldn't have been a thing. But it killed them, because they made a promise and they broke it. And you cannot do that in politics unless there's some obvious reason why you couldn't deliver on something, some traumatic event like 9/11 or all the rest of it. But on your broader point, as I said earlier, I think there is a real problem generally of disengagement between people and politicians and, you know, the political class, if you like. But I think outside London and some of England's large cities, there is a very real sense that half the country has done quite well, the other half hasn't. And that is something which, you know, governments of the day must attend to. And by the way, even in Scotland, where the result was, you know, 2/3 in favour, you know, you go outside Edinburgh and Glasgow and to some parts of Scotland, they have equal cause for complaint that, you know, they're losing out. It just so happens in Scotland, you know, it hasn't manifested itself in quite the same way yet. Now, how are we getting on?
Yeah, 2 more, I think.
Apparently your drinks are awaiting, that's fine. If there's a gentleman there, then there's a gentleman there.
Just changing to governance again. What lessons are going to be learned in terms of BHS, in terms of governance? Can we deal with that in a different way, or is that just another ticking time bomb in other organisations?
It's not the only one. What's curious about BHS is it appears to be owned by Mrs. Green, who lives in Monaco. But doesn't appear to take it seems to her husband who takes all the decisions in relation to it. I think, you know, this is a classic case of where Europe can help, actually, because it narrows down the places that people can run to. But you know, this is a case where you know, there will be questions asked of the pension regulator, you know, as to how it was allowed, the pension was hived off in this way. You know, I think you had an earlier session on this. One of the problems that, you know, individual countries face, it's very difficult to stop people going offshore. And the more jurisdictions there are, the easier it is to hide it. So I have no idea what corporate governance there was in an organisation that either Lord or Lady Green, or Sir and Philip and Lady Green happened to be running. I'm not sure there was. And there's certainly the organisation that bought it, I think corporate governance was probably one of the last things that was ever considered. Perhaps it's an example where if we're going to have to revisit our company law again, we might just have a look at the responsibility of directors, the personal responsibility of directors, to stop this, because it's quite scandalous that people who work for BHS all their life, and on any view, are not going to get the pension that they thought they were contributing into. And you know, I think we do need to look again at that. Yes.
I wondered what advice you would give to the finance leadership community in navigating business through these times, and our role in, I guess, addressing the issues that the referendum have focused in on.
My finance community, you mean?
The leadership community, the finance leadership community, such as this audience before you.
Well, you know, as I said, you know, at the start, I think this is a time when, you know, if problems are going to start re-emerging, it's going to be at a time when the economy slows down and you've got uncertainty. And that's why it's so, the best leadership, the best thing that boards or finance directors can do is to make sure their own organisation is properly run and they're alive to the issues to which they may become exposed, rather than, if you like, a proselytising role for the community at large. You know, I must say I have every respect for the finance director, or now ex-finance director of EDF, who pointed out that the sums simply don't add up with Hinkley Point. And actually this referendum may put an end to that anyway. You know, I think it's terribly important that every organisation, especially when you're under stress and strain, which a number of organisations are very alive to the risks. Because the one thing that will, you know, add to the general feeling that everything's not right is if we start seeing failures, whether especially, you know, if it were to happen in banks across Europe or companies, for that example. So I think that's the best thing you can do. Have we got time for one more?
Yeah, sure, we can take one.
Because I think there is just one more, I think. Yes.
Thank you. So we've heard a lot about immigration and population growth and the economic growth. I was wondering, how many plans does the government make longer term? I mean, we've heard that some short-term plans aren't made upon Brexit, but thinking more longer term, is endless economic growth and population growth a good thing? And the reason I ask this is I recently went to Shanghai. Fantastic economic growth in that city, but unbelievably densely populated, unbelievably polluted. Not a great place necessarily to spend one's life, unfortunately, I'm sad to say. So just wondered what your thoughts on that were. Thank you.
Well, I suppose the economy has been, not they measured it in these times, been growing for the last couple of thousand years. And generally speaking, with each advanced economies grow, people become more productive, and partly as a result of that, the population has been growing as well. Population growth is quite difficult to, it's not susceptible to central planning any more than, frankly, requiring a growth rate of a certain amount is susceptible. Our economy has grown at a trend rate of 2.5% for the last 100 years. And I remember asking when I was in the Treasury, all our experts there, why is it an assumption it's always going to be 2.5%, especially when it hasn't been for quite a long time now? Perhaps we do have to start looking at what our assumptions are about, trend rates of growth. What I do know is if you go and put spokes in the thing, then it becomes that much more difficult. I think on the Chinese point, and I've been to Shanghai as well, as a matter of policy, it always seemed to me that creating cities of 30 million is problematic because, the problems of pollution, quality of housing, and so on. I think a lot of, China's central planning has thrown up quite a lot of difficulties. They're going to have to sort them out. But you're right, both of those issues are difficult, but they're not readily solvable, frankly, by individual governments, no matter what they might tell you. But I can finish on this point, that there's two things governments can do in this world. One is they can help do things that make things better, but they can also refrain from doing things that make things worse. And that's just, it's always worth bearing in mind that sometimes in politics, doing nothing is quite a good thing.